And now for the last look. The tension between liberal democracy and authoritarian populism that we've seen play out across Europe in recent weeks is facing a new test in an entirely different part of the world. I'm talking about the Philippines, where voters will go to the polls on Monday in what one observer called the most consequential election in the country's recent history to choose a president to replace Rodrigo Duterte. But if you think that Duterte's brutal 6-year regime, with its attacks on the press and its deadly war on drugs, have tipped the scales in favor of democracy, you may be wrong. As the journalist Sheila Coronel writes for the FT, the current frontrunner is the only son of the country's notorious former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, who, alongside his wife Imelda, became international symbols of brutality, excess, and corruption during his decades-long reign. Over his time in office, he accumulated $10 billion by some estimates. As The Guardian writes, he invoked a period of martial law that lasted for nearly a decade, in which tens of thousands of political adversaries, student leaders, and writers were tortured and more than 3,000 killed. It all came to an end in 1986 when hundreds of thousands took to the streets in protest of Marcos's rule and in support of democracy. But the Philippines, like many other countries, has fallen victim to a dangerous backsliding. Ferdinand Marcos Jr., often known as Bongbong, has refused to apologize for his father's rule. He himself has been convicted of tax evasion and has mischaracterized his education at Oxford. And he has indicated that if elected president, he would protect Duterte against prosecution for his drug war in the International Criminal Court. And yet, Marcos Jr. leads the polls. According to one survey, he's at 58%. His closest competitor, the current Philippines Vice President, Leni Robredo, has run on democratic reform, good governance, transparency. She has criticized Duterte's brutality. And she is polling at around 25%. How did this happen? In part, it is born of the country's failures to fully reckon with its past. Marcos Sr. was never convicted of a crime in the country's courts, some of which are staffed with people appointed during his rule. The billions that the family embezzled have never been fully recovered. Moreover, the dynasty has already lived on. Imelda Marcos, whose thousands of pairs of shoes became an emblem of corruption during her tenure as First Lady, has been elected to the House of Representatives 4 times since her husband's ouster. As for his son, he has benefited from a high degree of nostalgia for the supposed lost glory of his father's rule. Many of Marcos Jr.'s supporters were not alive during the dictatorship. Textbooks tend not to grapple with its brutal legacy. And Marcos is extremely adept at manipulating the message online. As the Washington Post reports, videos abound on YouTube and TikTok that glorify and romanticize the family. Social media is rife with a rosy revisionist history of the dictatorship. Rumors float that if elected, Marcos will distribute gold to the public. This web of disinformation is extremely effective. About 99% of Filipinos are online, and over half of them can't identify fake news when they see it. What's happening in the Philippines is just another version of the same nostalgia-fueled populism we've seen all over the world. But in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it has newfound resonance. The Philippines' democratic transition occurred 5 years before the fall of the Soviet Union. The Constitution of 1987 was a moment of hope. Crucially, it established term limits. But ultimately, the work was incomplete. Reform stalled. The past was forgotten, then dressed up and paraded as glory. What we see in the Philippines is just one example of the contest playing out across the world. Let's hope for a better outcome there and elsewhere.